Hey there, cats and kitties. I am the Blues Man, Johnny Blues, and with this video I'll be discussing my thoughts on episode 7 of the anime series Beautiful Bones, Sakurako's Investigation. And the air of this episode was all kinds of enigmatic and mysterious as we're peeking once again through the portal of Sakurako-san's life, her relations, her uncle toward the end of this episode, which is like, WTF is going on with this? But first and foremost, I mean, you have Tatsuaki getting her to go to this scholastic festival thing, and it's very interesting to me that she agrees in the first place, but then she downs a whole plate of pancakes to boot, and she's off, of course, as Tatsuaki gets called away to go get some water. She starts skulking around this school. She goes into the science class. She's looking at the bones, becomes very consumed, and almost, going against the rules, going to put her hands on them and everything, which she gets reprimanded by Tatsuaki as he catches up with her. And it's quite convenient, and I thought, as soon as I heard bones were going to come into the fray with Tatsuaki's teacher, who is a self-professed botanist. He's much more familiar with, the flora and the fauna. He's not very much familiar with the human anatomy and the bones. They've got all of this, storeroom full of bones that have been packed away by the precursor science teacher, Sasaki Sensei. And he would really love to use, Sakurako's prowess, her smarts, to reconstruct these bones and use it as an extension of his curriculum for this science class. And as soon as I heard bones were going to be involved and they were going to be pulling out boxes, it was like, okay, where's the body? Where's the remains going to be? It's going to get this all, hyperventilated, all heated and everything like that. And sure enough, they find the sort of, cremated remains of a skeleton, which they figure out at a later point was actually this woman who was the caregiver for Sasaki Sensei's sister, apparently, Natsuoko. It's very interesting that because it left me to wonder with all the other boxes they pull out of, fauna and plant life, and there are boxes full of sort of poetry and written works and all this kind of stuff. I began to wonder if there was a relationship there between this Sasaki man and this Natsuoko woman, but of course that remains to be seen as yet. And as intriguing as all of that was, and I do kind of hope we get some sort of closure answers in the next half, being that this is the first part of presumably a two-parter, what I find coming to the forefront of my interests is the characterizations between Tatsuaki and Sakurako-san respectively, because he's very much motivated by her potentially having stolen some bones yet again. I mean, calling back to episode 1, she tries to make off with a skull they find on a beach, all this kind of stuff. Human remains, no. You can't take that stuff home, whatever the case may be. And it's interesting here, an entire skeleton of a cat goes missing, and we're calling back once again, looking through that portal of Sakurako's history, the fact that she found her cat dead, and it relates to that tree that we first encountered her standing under. She has some kind of tie to that tree between remembering her little brother as he was as a child, whether he is dead, or to, speak to my speculations that maybe this malevolent, enigmatic figure could be this puppet master, the Moriarty to Sakurako's Sherlock, if you will, as I've referred to him. That all remains to be seen, whether the brother is legitimately dead or this is him, returning with some malevolence, some murderous nature that she wants nothing to do with, all of that stuff. But whatever the case, she relates her first ever reconstructing bones to, effectively dissecting her dead cat to try to understand what killed it, why it died. And Tatsuaki is really having a hard time, as most people would, most people who aren't wired that way, he's having a hard time sort of, resigning that fact that she could sit there and cut open this pet. You think of a pet, you think of these animals that are loyal, and there's a companionship, a friendship, there's a bond, a simpatico between you and your pet, no matter what that pet happens to be, but especially if it's a dog or cat, one that you can play around with and pet and comfort, can lay next to you in bed and everything. It is a stress reliever. It's something that speaks to the nature of humanity, and that goes back eons, since these animals have existed and we've coexisted with them on this planet, where he's even put off by a box, full of dog remains sitting next to him, because he thinks of the animal. He thinks of Hector sitting back at Sakurako's place. He's equating the idea of what being around a cat is like, interacting with a cat is like. and how, he's basically questioning and starting to have reservations. How can Sakurako be so self-removed, so distant from that sort of normal framework of human understanding? How can she not sort of, comprehend where he's coming from, the very human reaction? I could never cut open my own pet. It's like when people hear about these foreign countries that make lunch out of the dogs we consider pets. It's unnatural to us, and it boggles our minds. At least for me, it gets me very upset as an animal lover and everything like that. And that's kind of how Tatawaki's reacting to the scenario as she's caressing the skull of this cat, which, as I say, the remains go missing, seemingly. And this is what is really the impetus behind Tatawaki's starting to question, have I been too tolerant with this woman? Have I completely misunderstood the way her mind works all along? And can I, in confronting that question, can I handle it? Can I still be around her with her being so different, so wired differently than I am, seeing the world in a completely different light the way that she does? She has this quality of being not socially inept because she can hold conversations. She can be very commanding over, a sort of an authoritarian amongst other people. But at the same time, and this is something I relate to as an artist or as a somewhat eccentric person as I am, I hate meaningless babble. I hate having meaningless conversations. How was the weather? Oh, did you hear that guy slipped off his bike on the sidewalk? I don't care. Is he okay? That's about all I care about. I don't want to have these pointless, stupid discussions. Oh, did you hear about so-and-so? Blah, blah, blah. I don't care. I want to have meaningful conversations. And that's very much how Sakurako is, but it goes beyond that. She has this wiring that goes all the way back to her childhood, and it's, of course, up in the air. It's rife for debate. What could have been the driving force behind those things? Was it the loss of this brother? Was it something familial? I mean, she goes to visit her uncle, for all intents and purposes, which, this is after she's seemingly stolen the cat remains, and the teacher has come back with the cakes that he promised her, and of course Tatawaki's going to deliver them, but her entire gate is shut, the house is all shut down, closed down, and it's really sort of adding insult to injury to his reservations. What is going on? Why, he's starting to question even his own reaction. And with this guilt complex, like maybe I was the wrong one. Maybe I shouldn't have been this way around her. I mean, of course he's going to be calling that into question. They were at sort of the festival in the last episode. He had to actually have the people call out her name because he's like the caregiver, he's like her guardian or whatever. She can't be off on her own. I mean, maybe that was a joke. Maybe that was sort of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge, because that's how eccentric her character is. Then again, maybe not. Maybe she really does have this sort of mental thing where like she has to have somebody who travels around with her. I don't know, but it's one of those things where it was tantamount to this episode to really be peeking inside both of these characters and further fleshing out, as well as creating more questions about how did these two come together? Why do they stick together? Are they, other than the sort of outlying familial ties and acquaintances and everything like that, what has put these two characters together? Why is Tatawaki, with how off-putting Sakurako's nature seems to be, other than the fact that she is an attractive woman, what else could drive him? Maybe he has similar fascinations he hasn't worked himself around to. Maybe he, like the John Watson character, even though they're sort of polar opposites, there's something between the Watson and the Sherlock characters where, for Watson, it's like something is drawing him to Sherlock perpetually. Because there's an excitement, there's a flair, there's an aspect of adventure, of life that he's never, before sort of experienced, or at least in Watson's case, since the war. But with Tatawaki, you can make those similar allusions. Like there's something exciting about being around a woman like Sakurako-san in her authoritarian nature, in her sheer intelligence, and sometimes even just how weird she is. He likes being the one who's the more dominant, in that she's got to kind of listen to whatever he says. And, she can only sort of walk around with him being there as a guide. Of course, she goes to see the uncle, and, that remains to be seen. She went on her own and everything like that. But it all speaks to that dynamic. And once again, like, calling this uncle into question, She seems to be visiting this person in what might be a nursing home, a hospital. You hear the heart monitor beeping steadily, and there is a computer interface, which is seemingly how this person, I guess, is like communicating with her. She's questioning, and that's another question I'm left with. She's questioning about looking into this cold case, or at least that's kind of what they're referring to it as, or insinuating it is. And I'm left wondering, is this to do with her cat? Is she like, did she recognize certain signs from the remains of this new cat she stole, she made off with from the classroom? And now she wants to, like, re-examine her own cat and look into... Surely not. Surely there's something much more deep involved in all of this. Does this relate back to this, Sasaki-sensei and this woman that they found the cremated remains of? Does it call back to her brother? Is her brother actually legitimately dead and she wants to understand how her brother died? I'm left with so many questions by the end of this episode, even though I have at the forefront, as I say, these compelling aspects of hers and Tatawaki's characters, their relationship dynamic. I mean, it's all quite compelling, and I'm really just left by the end dying to see where it goes in the next episode. The previous episode, I enjoyed it, and there were aspects of it that did hold over by the end, but it didn't excite me nearly as much as this episode. This episode brought it back up to the peak of being very excited to see how this unfolds and what mystery it is that she is so consumed with understanding, having another go at understanding, that she has to actually go and get the approval of her seemingly bedridden, if that was even a person. I didn't see a head in the bed, so I don't know. It just struck me as very, very compelling and intriguing. And I hope it offers us more of a look inside Sakurako and Tatawaki's dynamic, that character dynamic and relationship. I hope we see more of, her past. And maybe this will be a penultimate step closer to finding out who this enigmatic figure is and how he or she relates to Sakurako-san and her history. So, I mean, that's pretty much all I can say about this episode. I'm definitely going to be chomping at the bit to find out how this all plays out in the next. Love to hear from you guys in the comments below what you thought of episode 7 of Beautiful Bones, Sakurako's Investigation, if you've seen it as well, if you were as compelled by it and left just, sort of asking questions and very inquisitive to find out how this is going to play out, much as I was. Otherwise, that'll be pretty much it for me on this. Hope this video finds you well, and I'll catch you all later. Peace.